Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most foundational books in all of psychology. It's called Studies on Hysteria, and it was published way back in 1895 by two doctors from Vienna, Joseph Brouwer, and a young, up-and-coming neurologist you might have heard of, a guy named Sigmund Freud. And let me tell you, this book did way more than just document some strange medical cases. It basically stumbled into a revolution.
So, let's start with the question that just completely stumped the medical world of the 19th century. Imagine this. What if you developed a cough that just wouldn't stop? Or you went blind? Or maybe you couldn't move your arm? But every single physical exam showed that there was absolutely nothing wrong with your body. This was the paradox of hysteria. These were real, sometimes terrifying physical symptoms, but with no physical cause doctors could find.
All right, to figure out how Freud and Brouwer even began to tackle this, we're going to follow a kind of detective story in 5 parts. First, we'll look at the mystery itself. Then we'll see the birth of a totally radical new treatment. We'll watch as Freud starts to go his own way, planting the very first seeds of psychoanalysis. And finally, we have to grapple with the book's really complicated and controversial legacy. Okay, so picture it. It's the late 1800s. Medicine is making these incredible advances, mapping out the human body like never before. But then there's hysteria. It's just this frustrating black box. Honestly, getting diagnosed with hysteria said more about what doctors didn't know than what they knew about the patient. I mean, the disconnect was just maddening. You have patients with these severe, life-changing symptoms, but their bodies are, for all intents and purposes, perfectly healthy. The symptoms didn't even make sense from a medical standpoint. Like, there's this thing called glove anesthesia. Your hand goes totally numb, but your arm is fine. Well, that's impossible. No single nerve pathway works like that. So what happened? A lot of frustrated doctors just threw up their hands and dismissed these patients, who are almost all women, as fakers or just being hysterical. And into this confusing world steps Sigmund Freud. You can see his whole journey laid out here. It starts when he hears about Joseph Breuer's work. Then he goes to Paris to study with the great Charcot, who was one of the first to really insist that hysteria was a real disorder of the mind, not just attention-seeking. After that, he sees the power of hypnosis up close, and suddenly he has all the pieces. When he finally teams up with Breuer, they were ready to put forward something truly groundbreaking. And that groundbreaking idea? It really all comes down to one single crucial case study. The patient Breuer called Anna O. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, and what happened during her treatment became the stuff of legend. So Breuer discovers something incredible, almost by accident. He found that when Anna O was under hypnosis, if she just talked about her symptoms and their origins, they would disappear, at least for a while. But here's the amazing part. She came up with the name for it. With this incredible insight, she called it chimney sweeping. She knew, intuitively, that by talking, she was clearing out all the soot and grime from her own mind. This process became known as the cathartic method, and here's basically how it worked. First, you use hypnosis to kind of lower the patient's mental defenses. Then, you guide them to track a symptom all the way back to the very first time it appeared. Now, step 3, a reaction. This is the real game changer. The patient doesn't just remember what happened, they relive the powerful trapped emotion connected to it. And finally, they put that whole experience into words. And the result? Poof, the symptom would often vanish. So what exactly is this abreaction thing? Well, think of it like a pressure valve releasing, or maybe a dam breaking. It's that sudden, powerful moment when a forgotten traumatic memory comes rushing back. And with it comes all the emotion that was locked away with it. The fear, the anger, the grief. For Brouwer and Freud, this emotional explosion was absolutely essential. Without it, there was no cure.
This all led them to their most radical conclusion, which is summed up perfectly in this famous line. Hysterical patients weren't sick because of some physical disease. They were suffering from reminiscences. They were suffering from memories. These were unprocessed, forgotten memories that had essentially gone bad, festered, and then converted themselves into the physical language of symptoms. They were quite literally being haunted by their own past.
Now, here's the thing. While Brouwer was pretty happy with this method, Freud Well, he wasn't. As he started using it on his own patients, he kept running into walls. For one, not everybody could even be hypnotized. And sometimes, even when it worked, the cures didn't stick. He knew there was something missing, that the technique needed to evolve. And this is where he really starts to carve out his own unique path. And here we see the first big split. Brouwer's whole method depended on hypnosis to get around the conscious mind. Freud, though, found hypnosis to be a bit unreliable, so he developed something he called the pressure technique. He would literally place his hand on a patient's forehead and insist that a memory would come to them. See the shift? It's a move from a passive technique to a much more active, even confrontational one that demanded the patient's conscious mind get involved in the work. In doing this, Freud stumbled onto something brand new and incredibly important: resistance. He started to notice that as a patient got closer and closer to a really painful memory, they'd start to fight it. They'd suddenly change the subject or say their mind went blank. And here's the genius insight. Freud realized this wasn't the patient failing, it was a clue. This resistance was an unconscious protective force. And wherever that force was strongest, well, that was like a big flashing neon sign pointing directly at the source of the problem. So if resistance is the force pushing back during therapy, what was the force that buried the memory in the first place? Freud gave that a name too: repression. Now, this isn't just forgetting where you put your keys. Repression is an active, unconscious process. It's the mind taking a memory that's just too painful or shameful to deal with and forcibly shoving it out of your conscious awareness. For Freud, this was the engine that created those toxic reminiscences. Okay, this is where things get really interesting. And let's be honest, really controversial. Because as Freud kept digging, he started to unearth ideas that would not only define his entire career, but would also blow up his partnership with his mentor, Joseph Brouwer. So what was the clue? The uncomfortable thing that kept showing up in his office was sex. Again and again, Freud found that the repressed, pathogenic memories his patients were fighting so hard to keep buried were sexual in nature, whether it was about trauma or forbidden desires or inner conflicts. Now, for the very conservative Brouwer, and for society back then, this was just too much. But Freud was determined to follow the evidence, no matter where it led. And then he found something else, something that would become the absolute cornerstone of his new technique. This little story from his writings explains it perfectly. During a session, a female patient suddenly confesses she has an intense wish for Freud to kiss her. Now, a different doctor might have been flattered or maybe horrified, but Freud had this flash of insight. He realized this feeling, it wasn't really about him. It was an old feeling, probably from a key relationship in her past, like with her father, that was being misplaced or falsely connected onto him, right there in the therapy room. He gave this phenomenon a name: transference. It's this unconscious process of redirecting feelings and desires from old, important relationships onto the therapist. You know, at first, he just saw it as another form of resistance, another roadblock. But we quickly realized it was the exact opposite. Transference was the very stage where the patient's deepest, most hidden conflicts would be acted out. And because of that, it was the place where they could finally be understood and maybe even resolved. So that brings us to the legacy of studies on hysteria. It's an absolute landmark book, no doubt. But the story doesn't end with a neat, tidy cure. Its legacy is just as complicated and debated as the theories inside it. And this brings us right to the elephant in the room. Was Anna O, the poster child for this amazing new talking cure, actually cured? The historical record is pretty clear on this. No, not even close. The story Brouwer published was, let's say, heavily embellished. The reality is that Bertha Pappenheim had to be institutionalized again. She struggled with a morphine addiction from the sedatives Brouwer gave her, and the therapy ended in disaster when she developed an intense transference that Brouwer just couldn't handle. And the debate over what really causes hysteria? It didn't end there either. It's still going on today. For example, some psychoanalytic schools, especially in France, still really focus on Freud's original link between hysteria and sexuality, but others, like the British school, see it totally differently, more as a defense against crushing anxiety from our very first relationships as infants. The point is, these questions that Freud and Brouwer opened up, they are still very much alive. But look, Despite the historical problems and the endless debates, you just can't deny the impact of this book. It put the talking cure on the map as a legitimate form of therapy. It gave us the core vocabulary of psychoanalysis, the unconscious, repression, resistance, transference. It proved that what happens in your mind can actually make your body sick. It basically cracked open a door, and through that door walked the entire field of modern psychotherapy.
And that's the real takeaway here. All these ideas we kind of take for granted now, that talking about things helps, that our childhood shapes who we are, that buried emotions can make us physically ill, all of that has its roots right here, in this book. Studies on Hysteria, with all of its flaws, is basically the source code for how we talk about trauma and mental health today. It taught us that our stories matter, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine we have isn't a pill, but is simply finding the right words.